The brass canister was sealed with a band of soldered lead. When I cut it open, the smell of damp canvas and oxidized copper filled the room. Inside lay a roll of Eastman Kodak negative film, frozen solid for 33 years in the ice of Kvitoya. The emulsion was brittle, the celluloid stiff as tin. I spent 4 days slowly thawing the cylinder in a vapor chamber before attempting to unspool it. These were the last visual records of Salomon August Andrée, Knut Frænkel, and Nils Strindberg. They departed Danes Island on July 11, 1897, suspended beneath a massive hydrogen balloon. They intended to float across the North Pole. Instead, they vanished into the white expanse, leaving behind only silence and this frozen. Salomon August Andrée was a mechanical engineer. He worked at the Swedish patent office in Stockholm, a man accustomed to precise measurements, schematics, and the rigid laws of physics. In 1893, he purchased his first balloon, the Svea, and made 9 ascents. He recorded the barometric pressure, the temperature gradients, and the wind currents. He concluded that a balloon could be steered. This was the foundation of his polar expedition. He proposed a cross-polar flight from Svalbard to Russia or Canada, passing directly over the North Pole. The balloon he commissioned was manufactured in Paris by Henri Lechambre. It was named the Örnen, or the Eagle. It was constructed of 3 layers of Chinese silk, varnished twice to prevent the hydrogen from escaping. The volume was 170,000 cubic feet. The basket was made of wicker and woven cane, measuring roughly 2 meters in diameter and 1.5 meters deep. It was designed to carry 3 men, scientific instruments, provisions for 4 months, and ballast. The steering mechanism was Andrée's own invention. It relied on a system of heavy drag ropes trailing beneath the basket. The theory dictated that the friction of these ropes dragging across the Arctic ice would slow the balloon to a speed slightly less than the wind. By utilizing sails mounted on the suspension ring above the basket, Andrée calculated he could alter the course of the balloon by up to 27 degrees from the direction of the wind. The ropes were made of coir, thick and heavy, weighing hundreds of kilograms. They were fitted with screw joints so they could be detached if they became snagged in the ice. The scientific community was divided. Some engineers supported the mathematics of the drag ropes. Others, including experienced Arctic navigators, pointed out that the ice was not a smooth surface, but a jagged landscape of pressure ridges and open water leads. They argued the ropes would catch, jerking the balloon violently or anchoring it completely. Andrée dismissed these concerns. He relied on his calculations. He secured funding from the Swedish king, Oscar II, and Alfred Nobel. The provisions were meticulously planned. They packed pemmican, chocolate, biscuits, condensed milk, and champagne. They carried a sledge, a canvas boat, snowshoes, a tent, and 3 double-barreled shotguns with ammunition. The scientific payload included a theodolite, sextants, chronometers, thermometers, and an anemometer. They also carried 36 carrier pigeons, housed in small wicker cages, and several cork buoys designed to be dropped over the side with messages sealed inside. Every item was weighed and catalogued. The total payload, including the men, was 3,000 kilograms. Andrée believed the balloon would remain aloft for 30 days. He believed the wind would carry them across the pole in less than a week. He spent the winter of 1895 overseeing the construction of the silk envelope in Paris, testing the tensile strength of the seams. He demanded perfection from the men. The expedition first assembled on Danes Island, an outpost off the northwest coast of Spitsbergen, in the summer of 1896. They constructed a massive wooden balloon house to shelter the Örnen during inflation. The structure was an octagonal hangar, built of heavy timber and canvas, open at the top. It stood as a strange monument on the barren rock, surrounded by the gray waters of the Arctic Ocean. The inflation process was laborious. They generated hydrogen on site using a chemical reaction of sulfuric acid, water, and iron filings. The gas was piped through a washing apparatus to remove impurities before entering the silk envelope. In 1896, the crew consisted of Andrée, Niels Ekholm, and Nils Strindberg. Strindberg was a 23-year-old physicist and photographer, tasked with documenting the geography of the pole. Ekholm was an older, experienced meteorologist. They inflated the balloon in late June and waited for a favorable wind from the south. They waited through July. They waited into August. The wind remained stubbornly out of the north, blowing directly from the pole they intended to cross. During this waiting period, Ekholm began to measure the leakage rate of the balloon. He calculated that the Örnen was losing 45 cubic meters of hydrogen per day. He determined that the balloon would not stay aloft long enough to reach the pole, let alone cross it. He presented his findings to Andree. Andree reviewed the figures but refused to alter the plan. Ekholm stated he would not participate in a flight he deemed mathematically doomed. When the expedition finally abandoned the attempt in mid-August and deflated the balloon, Ekholm formally resigned. The failure of 1896 brought heavy criticism from the European press. Andree returned to Stockholm and defended his methods. He ordered Lechamber to enlarge the balloon, increasing its volume to 170,000 cubic feet to compensate for the leakage. He also needed a replacement for Ekholm. He selected Knut Frænkel, a 27-year-old civil engineer from Karlstad. Frænkel was strong, athletic, and possessed a calm demeanor. He was assigned the role of meteorologist, despite having less experience than Ekholm. In late May of 1897, the expedition returned to Danes Island. The balloon house had survived the winter, though it required repairs. They began the inflation process again on June 19th. The iron filings and sulfuric acid hissed in the wooden vats. The smell of the gas hung heavy over the island. By July 1st, the balloon was fully inflated, straining against the netting inside the wooden hangar. Once again, they waited for the wind. The men spent their days checking the instruments, feeding the pigeons, and watching the anemometer. The tension of the previous year hung over the camp. Andree knew he could not return to Sweden a second time without launching. The press, the financiers, and his own pride demanded an ascent. They waited 10 days. On the morning at 10:30 in the morning on July 11th, 1897, Andree made the decision to launch. The wind was blowing at roughly 8 meters per second. The sky was overcast, the temperature hovering just above freezing. The ground crew began the process of dismantling the northern wall of the balloon house. It took nearly 3 hours to remove the heavy timber panels. The Örnen swayed in the gusts, the varnished silk rustling loudly against the hemp netting. At 1:50 in the afternoon, the three men climbed into the wicker basket. Strindberg checked his cameras. Frænkel secured the meteorological instruments. Andree stood by the ballast bags. He gave the order to cut the holding ropes. The balloon rose. It did not rise smoothly. As it cleared the shelter of the balloon house, the full force of the wind caught the massive envelope. The Örnen was driven horizontally toward the water. Then, the critical failure occurred. The three heavy drag ropes, which were supposed to trail behind the basket and provide steering friction, had been laid out on the beach. As the balloon moved out over the water, the ropes twisted. The screw joints, designed to release only if snagged on heavy ice, unscrewed themselves under the torsional strain. Within minutes of the launch, 2/3 of the drag ropes detached and fell onto the shoreline. The balloon instantly lost 530 kilograms of weight. Freed from this massive burden, the Örnen shot upward. It ascended rapidly to an altitude of over 700 meters. At this height, the atmospheric pressure was lower and the hydrogen expanded. The automatic gas valves at the top of the envelope opened, venting precious hydrogen to prevent the silk from bursting. The balloon lost a significant portion of its lifting gas in the first 10 minutes of the flight. The ground crew watched from Danes Island. They saw the balloon descend just as rapidly as it had risen. It dropped toward the gray water of the Sound. The basket dipped into the sea, dragging through the waves. The men in the basket threw out hundreds of kilograms of sand ballast to arrest the descent. The balloon rose again, clearing the water, but it was now flying free, without the drag ropes that were the foundation of Andree's steering theory. It moved northward, driven entirely by the wind. The ground crew watched it shrink to a dark speck against the low clouds. At roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it passed out of sight behind the mountainous coast of Vogelsang Island. The men on Danes Island recorded the final bearing. The wind was carrying the Örnen directly toward the polar ice pack. The launch had been chaotic, the steering mechanism was lost, and a large volume of gas had been vented. But they were airborne. The ground crew packed up the camp and boarded their ship for the return to Sweden. The silence settled back over Danes Island, broken only by the sound of the wind through the empty timber frame of the balloon. The silence from the expedition began immediately. Andree had arranged for a system of communication using the 36 carrier pigeons and a series of cork buoys. The pigeons were intended to be released at intervals, carrying small cylinders containing messages written on parchment. The buoys were designed to be dropped into the open water leads, where the ocean currents would eventually carry them to the coasts of Norway or Iceland. For days after the launch, on July 15th, the Norwegian sealing vessel Örnen was operating near the edge of the pack ice. The captain observed a bird resting on the rigging. It was a carrier pigeon. A crew member shot the bird. When they retrieved it from the water, they found a small parchment cylinder attached to its tail feathers. The message inside was written in Andree's hand. It was dated July 13th, 12:30 in the afternoon. The coordinates listed were 82 degrees, 2 minutes north latitude, and 15 degrees, 5 minutes east longitude. The message read, "Good journey eastwards. All well on board. This is the third pigeon post. Andree." This was the only pigeon ever recovered. It confirmed that the balloon had survived for at least 2 days and had reached a latitude of 82 degrees. After that, nothing. Weeks turned into months. The Arctic winter descended, freezing the ocean and plunging the region into continuous darkness. The Swedish government organized search expeditions in 1898 and 1899. They scoured the coasts of Svalbard, Franz Josef Land, and northern Russia. They found nothing. Over the next 3 decades, the ocean currents delivered a few fragments. In 1899, a cork buoy was found on the northern coast of Iceland. It contained a message dated July 11th, just hours after the launch, stating they were moving northeast at an altitude of 250 meters. Another buoy was found empty. In 1900, a third buoy was discovered on the coast of Norway. It was the North Pole buoy, designed to be dropped exactly at the pole. It had been opened, the message removed, and resealed. It offered no coordinates. The disappearance of the Örnen became a fixed mystery of the Arctic. Theories circulated in the press. Some suggested the balloon had been blown into the uncharted wastes of the Canadian archipelago. Others believed it had crashed into the ocean and the men had drowned immediately. A few maintained they had been killed by indigenous hunters in Siberia. I reviewed the meteorological data from July 1897. The wind patterns suggested a trajectory toward the east, toward Franz Josef Land or Novaya Zemlya. But the ice held its record tight. For 33 years, the fate of Andree, Frænkel, and Strindberg remained entirely unknown. The men who had watched them launch from Danes Island grew old and died. The wooden balloon house rotted and collapsed into the rock. The ledgers were closed. The expedition was officially classified as lost with all hands. The silence of the northern latitudes was absolute, offering no. In the summer of 1930, the Norwegian sealing vessel Brattvåg was operating in the waters east of Svalbard. The ship was carrying a scientific expedition led by Dr. Gunnar Horn, tasked with studying the glaciers and geology of the region. On August 5th, the Brattvåg approached Kvitoya, or White Island. Kvitoya is a desolate place, almost entirely covered by an ice dome, with only a few rocky promontories exposed on the western and eastern shores. It is notoriously difficult to approach due to heavy pack ice and persistent fog. The summer of 1930 was unusually warm. The pack ice had retreated further north than usual, and the snow cover on the rocky shores of Kvitoya had melted significantly. On August 6th, a group of sealers from the Brattvåg went ashore on the western point of the island to hunt walrus. While walking along the rocky beach, 2 of the men, Olaf Salen and Karl Tusvik, noticed a dark object resting against the side of a low cliff. They approached the object. It was a canvas boat, partially buried in the gravel and ice. The canvas was bleached and stiff, the wooden frame warped. Inside the boat, they found a chaotic assortment of equipment: a sledge, snowshoes, a tent, cooking utensils, and a large quantity of clothing. The items were heavy with moisture and dirt. Scattered around the boat were human bones. The sealers alerted Dr. Horn, who came ashore to examine the site. He recognized the nature of the discovery immediately. The equipment was not the crude gear of shipwrecked whalers. It was specialized polar equipment. Horn directed a careful excavation of the camp. They found a brass stove, a theodolite, and a heavy canvas sleeping bag. Inside the sleeping bag lay the skeletal remains of a man. The clothing on the remains bore a monogram. The letters were A. It was Salomon August Andrée. A short distance away, partially concealed in a cleft in the rocks, they found a second set of remains. A monogram on the jacket identified Nils Strindberg. He had been buried under a shallow pile of stones, though the rocks had been disturbed, likely by polar bears. The remains of the third man, Knut Frænkel, were found later, lying near the canvas boat. The camp was a debris field of survival. The men of the Brattvag collected everything they could carry. They found tins of pemmican, boxes of ammunition, and several heavy footlockers. Inside these lockers, wrapped in layers of damp clothing, they found the most critical artifacts of the expedition: the logbooks, the diaries, and the rolls of exposed photographic film. The paper was saturated with water, the ink smeared, the pages frozen together. Horn ordered the documents placed in sealed containers. They gathered the remains of the three men, loaded the artifacts onto the Brattvag, and departed Kvitoya. The discovery made international headlines. The 33-year silence had been broken. The artifacts were transported to Tromsø, Norway, and then to Sweden, where a team of conservators and scientists began the conservation of the diaries was a delicate operation. The pages were dried between sheets of blotting paper, and the faded pencil marks were deciphered under specialized lighting. Strindberg's almanac and Andree's primary journal provided a detailed, day-by-day account of the expedition. The record revealed that the balloon flight had lasted only 65 hours. After the launch and the loss of the drag ropes, the Örnen had drifted northeast. The weather deteriorated rapidly. Freezing fog enveloped the balloon. Ice accumulated on the varnished silk, adding massive weight to the envelope. The balloon was forced down, the basket repeatedly striking the pack ice. For 2 days, the men endured a brutal cycle. The balloon would lift slightly, drift a few hundred meters, and then crash heavily into the ice ridges. On July 14th, at a latitude of 82 degrees, 56 minutes north, the balloon finally came to rest on the ice. The men abandoned the basket. They were uninjured, but they were stranded nearly 300 kilometers from the nearest land. The diaries detailed their subsequent actions. They spent a week at the crash site, packing the sledges and preparing for a march south toward the depot at Cape Flora in Franz Josef Land. They loaded the sledges with an immense amount of gear. Each sledge weighed over 200 kilograms. They packed the canvas boat, the tent, the heavy double-barreled shotguns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and provisions for several months. They even packed the heavy, wet drag ropes, intending to use them as fuel or building material. The march began on July 22nd. The conditions were severe. The pack ice was not a flat plain, but a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges, deep snow, and open water leads. The men had to drag the heavy sledges over walls of ice 2 meters high. They frequently had to unload the sledges, ferry the equipment across open water in the canvas boat, and reload on the other side. The diaries recorded their daily progress. Some days they advanced only 2 kilometers. Worse than the terrain was the ice drift. The ocean currents beneath the pack ice were moving steadily to the northwest. The men were walking south, but the ice they were walking on was drifting north. On several occasions, after a week of exhausting labor, Strindberg's astronomical observations revealed they were further north than when they had started. In early August, they abandoned the plan to reach Franz Josef Land and turned southwest, aiming for the 7 islands north of Svalbard. The labor continued. They shot polar bears and seals to supplement their rations, eating the meat raw or lightly boiled over their Primus stove. The diaries note the physical toll: exhaustion, snow blindness, and severe gastrointestinal distress. Yet, the tone of the entries remained remarkably clinical. They recorded the temperature, the wind direction, and the coordinates. They did not record despair. Strindberg continued to take photographs, documenting the crashed balloon, the dead bears, and the men hauling the sledges through the slush. The frozen film I thawed in the laboratory contained these exact images. By mid-September, the men recognized they would not reach the 7 islands before winter. They halted their march and constructed a winter camp on a large ice floe. They built a hut out of ice blocks and snow, reinforcing the walls with the canvas boat and the remaining balloon silk. They named it the home of the ice. They stockpiled bear and seal meat. The diaries from this period indicate a resignation to wintering on the ice, but they still maintained order and discipline. On October 2nd, the ice shifted. The The floe fractured directly beneath their hut. The structure collapsed, and much of their equipment was thrown into the freezing water. They managed to salvage the sledges and the boat, but their winter shelter was destroyed. The ocean currents had carried their fractured floe to the shores of Kvitoya. On October 5th, they made landfall on the western beach. It was the first time they had stood on solid ground in 87 days. They established a new camp against the rocky cliff. They moved the equipment ashore and set up the tent. The final diary entries were written in the days immediately following the landing. Strindberg's almanac contains a few brief notes about moving gear. Andree's journal ends with a few scattered sentences about the weather and the condition of the camp. The handwriting is erratic, the pages stained. After October 8th, the written record stops completely. The exact cause of their deaths remains undocumented. The physical evidence at the camp provided no definitive answers. They had ample food. The sealers found large quantities of bear meat stacked near the tent, along with remaining tins of pemmican and biscuits. They had ammunition and functional rifles, with dozens of rounds still in the footlockers. They had heavy clothing, sleeping bags, and the brass primus stove with fuel remaining in the reservoir. The skeletal remains showed no signs of violent trauma or animal predation prior to death. Strindberg died first, as evidenced by his deliberate burial in the rock cleft. Andree and Frænkel died later, their remains found unburied, one inside the collapsed tent and the other near the canvas boat. Various hypotheses have been proposed based on the recovered items. Some point to the presence of trichinosis parasites in the bear meat, suggesting a fatal infection that weakened them over weeks. Others suggest carbon monoxide poisoning from operating the primus stove inside the tightly sealed tent during a winter storm. Still others propose sheer exposure, cumulative exhaustion, or botulism from the canned provisions. I examined the stove, the rusted tins, and the stiffened clothing. The artifacts confirm their presence, their labor, and their end. They do not confirm the mechanism of their failure. The journals end abruptly, and the men simply cease to be. The exact sequence of events that claimed the lives of the three men on Kvitoya is still not known. If these stories of vanished crews and silent ships speak